I'm going to tell a story which is a little bit of a moshel about chinuch, about education. Imagine a moonless night some 94 years ago at the Russian-Polish border. A small group of Bacharim are attempting to escape from Bolshevik Russia into Poland, where in Poland they can learn Torah openly. A non-Jewish smuggler has been paid to lead them across the border, and he cynically sets a blistering pace. Among the group, the youngest, a small, skinny 14-year-old, is desperately trying to keep up. He is exhausted and near collapse. He dare not ask them to stop, because delay could mean failure and could be fatal. An older boy of 16, of stronger build, realizes the plight of his young friend. He bends down, lifts the younger boy onto his shoulders, and carries him to freedom. Now, this is not just a moshel describing what our mission as mechanchim, that is, to bend down and lift up all of our talmidim. Or as the Rebbe famously answered to Rabbi Yosef Weinberg, Zichron Livrocha, who had apologized for leaving a note underneath the door of the Rebbe's office. And then he realized that the Rebbe had to bend down and pick up the paper, so he apologized. The Rebbe brushed away the apology, and he said, Haloi ze kol inyoni, isn't this what I am about? That I lower myself to lift up, to elevate. So that is, in the sense, a moshel, a parable about education. But this is not merely a parable, it is a true story. It actually happened. The younger, weaker boy was my father, Avi Meiri, Rav Yosef Avram, Zichron Livrocha, and the older boy who bent down, picked him up on his shoulders, and saved his life was Rav Yisroel Hazdan, Zichron Livrocha, the father of our guest speaker. And my good friend Rav Dovid Hazdan is like his father before him. He carries on his broad shoulders, as Dean of Torah Academy, a school of over 600 Talmidim, and if that's not enough, he also is the Rav of the Great Park Synagogue, which he led from small beginnings and now has grown to over 800 members and is one of the most active shul campuses in South Africa. He comes here in his chinuch capacity, not his rabbinic leadership, but we are very honored to have him here tonight, and please join me in welcoming to the podium Harav Dovid Hazdan.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kagan. My father always mentioned about that story, that his uncle, Vetter Zalman Hazdan, who was the sheikhet in Hummel before Chanka Shagalov, when he kissed him at that station just before they went on that walk that was just described, he kissed him and he said the words of Akavi ben Mahalalel, Ma'asechia Karvucha and Ma'asechia Rachkucha, which were the words that my father kissed me with when I left the yeshiva 16 years old on the way to Kfar Chabad. And then it became a thing in the family as my daughters and my son left to yeshiva or to seminaries. Those were the words, but I don't think on that fateful night in 1924 they ever imagined that there was going to be a continuation and that there would be chinuch beyond the darkness that they were emerging from. Rabbi Zalman Schneer, Executive Director of Menachem Foundation, the Vaad Ruchni, the Convention Committee, the Board of Directors, the partners in chinuch, particularly Mr. Nathan Franco and your guests and family, the Rabbonim, Mechanchim, Mechanchos, and my dear colleagues. It is a great honor to come from South Africa and to be standing in amidst this august gathering of people, and to have had the privilege of spending hours today involved in some of these sessions, continuing to learn and continuing to hear, and seeing young mechanchim with such energy, with such fire, taking chinuch up a notch to a new world, to new realms, caring and thinking of the pride that is so deserved by the people giving their lives to make sure that the next day is going to have what it requires. And as has been mentioned this evening and throughout the day, the Zman Groma, the power of time, the season that we find ourselves in, the fact that it is 40 years since the launch of Shnas HaChinuch and Mivtza Chinuch and the 12 Psukim, it all started in that particular year. And 40 years later, one is seeing a re-energizing of the process of chinuch here in Crown Heights and spreading around the world, reaching the many different members and mechanchim present and beyond. It's also been mentioned that it's Shnas Hakel, and it is a Hakel gathering because there are people from all over America, Australia, and South Africa. We have our winter vacation at this stage of our lives. So we're happy to be here too. So it is a gathering, and it is the shame lifting up the values and the knowledge of Torah. And then coming from Gimel Tammuz, which is our time to reinvigorate our connection to the Rebbe, our hiskashrus, our recognition that this whole world that has been affected by chinuch was anchored and is led by our Rebbe. And our connection to the Rebbe gives us the koach and the strength to carry on even in the darkest, most difficult and challenging moments. It was in Tafshin Mem Gimel that my wife and I went on shlichus to South Africa. I was going back to Africa. My wife was going to darkest Africa. And a few months after we arrived, we went on a caravan vacation in December. It was Kislev time, a few months after we had arrived, to see the beautiful garden route. I wanted to convince her that it was a beautiful country. Caravan was a little bit not the norm for a Jewish holiday. I think we had our first and our last attempt at camping all wrapped up in the same event. We went twice that time, first and last. But in that event, I looked at the map and saw that Shabbos, obviously we needed to be in a place there was a minyan, and at that time the only place that there was a minyan in that particular area was a town called Otzhuren. Otzhuren was known for its feathers. They produced ostrich feathers in tons, and it was at that time the flair of fashion to have feathers. So there were magnates that made huge fortunes in that town, but this was already after all of their successes were almost over. And I parked my caravan in the municipal caravan park of Otzhuren community, and there was obviously no other Jew in the caravan park. They just didn't go on vacations in that way. It was filled with a lot of Afrikaans speaking. There's all Dutch members of the South African community. And it was a Saturday morning. It was 110 degrees in the shade. And everyone was playing outside. Obviously, the kids in their shorts. They were absolutely sweltering in the sun. And I opened the caravan door, dressed in my kapota, and to boot the talis on top of it. And everybody stared up in absolute dismay. They couldn't believe what was emerging from this caravan in the municipal caravan park of Otzhuren. And as I was walking through the crowds, everything stopped. There was not a whisper. Everybody was just watching me walking through in this thick silence. The ball stop between two kids. That is how thick it was. There was not a sound. Until eventually somebody had mercy, Rahmanas, and broke the silence and said, "Oh, so what do you wear when you're cold?" And I walked on to shul, and I was thinking to myself, this was not just a comment made by somebody making light. This was an existential question. This was one of my first questions I had to confront in the first months of Shlichus in South Africa. Here was somebody asking me, what do you wear when you're cold? And maybe the question to me was, what am I going to look like if chas v'shalom we lose the warmth, the chayas, the power, the energy, the fervor, the connection? If chas v'shalom we're going to lose the fire in our souls, what are we going to look like? And that is how I took his story, and I hear his voice in the background so often as I think and consider about the next stages of chinuch and of shlichus. The key challenge of our generation has to be the responsibility to chinuch. The ma'ana sheyitzave es bonav es beisa acharav is the challenge to see whether we have the capacity not only to receive, but to receive in such a way that we're going to impact on everyone else as well, and on particularly the next generation. And in Kolei HaChinuch VaHadracha, it lists so clearly the distinction and the difference between teaching and educating, and how important it is to realize that the responsibility of chinuch is not only about information. It's not only about being able to ensure that somebody else understands what it is, the subject matter that I'm teaching. It is much deeper, and it is on a foundation of the recognition of connection of souls, of realizing that we need to connect each child, L'Avinu Shebashamayim, to the Rebbe, to the beautiful words of the Torah that we're teaching him, that we are inculcating emunah, faith, belief, that this is something that is far beyond the reach of technical knowledge that we are imparting. But it is on all of that that we begin to build. It has to be on that foundation that we begin to build. And we build further by ensuring that the instruction and the lessons are going to be professional, are going to be inspired, are going to be with knowledge, that we are able to use each moment in a way that impacts in the best way possible on that child. And as the Frierdiker Rebbe says, it is a huge privilege, but with it a huge responsibility. Somebody said in one of the sessions today that the children are the barometer of who we are. And if they are behaving or acting up or whatever they're doing is probably the best indication of where we are. So if it is about reaching the neshama of the children, it's got to start by first reaching into the neshama of ourselves. What is it that we are powered by when we teach? And of course, the main reasons cannot be the fame and the fortune, because that is not the facts on the ground. So what is it that drove us? Why did we make the decision to go into chinuch? And that is something I think we have to ask ourselves every single night at Kriya Shema Shalamita. Why? Why did I go into chinuch? And if we can be plugged into the real reasons why it is we went into chinuch, that we saw this as a shlichus. We saw this as a shlichus of the most paramount importance. That this is how I connect myself to the Rebbe. That I fulfill the responsibilities of chinuch is something la'ila la'ila. And that is the driving force as to why I wake up in the morning to go into a classroom. What that helps so much for is that if we are driven by the recognition or the praise that we receive from a parent, a beautiful note that we might receive on a particular morning, and then we're flying and we're on top. We feel like we've made it. We feel so happy. And the next day somebody, Gita Zoga Ryan, sends us a note that is totally unfair and hurtful. And we do the roller coaster. We go from the top, and now we're all the way at the bottom. And now we're not quite sure if we want to teach at all. If we are governed by the responses of people, and that's how we go to school in the morning, we don't stand a chance. We'll never survive. the challenges of chinuch. It would have to be based on the fact that we are connected to the moment, each moment of every day, knowing that we're in the classroom for the reasons, the real reasons that we are there. And if those are the reasons, then we can overcome a down day, and we can overcome the tzaras and the difficulty, because we're connected to something far more important. And I think it is a necessary requirement that each day before we go into the classroom, even if it's for 30 seconds, to say l'shem mitzvahs, to close one's eyes and say just for 30 seconds, Rabbi, I'm going to the classroom now as a shliach. That's the reason I'm going in. I'm going in to make a difference in people's lives. And if one goes into the classroom with that energy, with that sense, with that feeling, the children will know it. They'll know immediately whether you've come in under the burden and the pain and the frustration of a difficult day, or whether you're there because you're loving to be there. They'll know immediately as you begin to talk. There's this difficult episode that unfolds in the book of Bereshis, and it's the story of Hagar. And we know the story, we read it on Rosh Hashanah, where unfortunately a child is pained by the desert, parched, thirsty. And the story of the Torah tells us in intricate detail what she was thinking and what she was doing. There was no water to drink. She cast the child aside. And she said the words, like, how can I possibly see the death of my child? And she was crying. And then incredulously, the Malach arrives. And what does he have to say? He says, Malach Hagar. Why are you crying, Hagar? Like, had a bad day at the office today? It's like, is there a problem going on? He stares and sees that this child is dying. There's a mother watching her child die in the desert sun. And he's asking her, like, what's up? Like, is anything happening? Why are you crying, Hagar? Is anything really bothering you right now? It seems the most incredulous question to ask. But maybe if we take the question more literally, what the Malach was saying to Hagar was, Malach Hagar, what's with you, Hagar? Look what's happening around you. Malach Hagar, how come you are responding in the way you are? Kumi, seyes hayalet, yelet. Lift yourself up. Raise up with the child. Hachzik yes yadeich boy. This is a time to give strength and a time to give power. This is not a time for despondency and a time to recognize the pain of the moment in a way that you, chas v'shalom, give up. Is that the role of a mother at such a time? What he was asking is, how could you be crying at such a moment when you ought to be saving the life of a child? And we know the rest of the story. Suddenly, Vayifakach Elokim es einah, the Eivishter opens up her eyes at all that it took. And suddenly she sees there was water to drink from. And perhaps the story is telling us about the critical moment between despair and acting on what it is that is confronting us. It is, in a sense, easy to say, I give up. It's painful. I cry. I don't want to see what's going on. And there are so many people that are looking at the challenges of our generation, our children, and they're saying, what can we do? And then there are some people in this world, such as yourselves and Kate Yirbu, who have said this is not a time for despondency and for crying. This is a time to rise and to lift up that child. Lift up every child in my classroom. Recognize the power that can be given to this moment to produce change rather than to succumb to it. It was a while ago that I had to present to my community the challenge of raising funds for our new campus. And the challenge was not only to get people to vote with their hands, but to vote with their money, which is a little bit more complicated, And it was a task that Yom Kippur, which is the time that there's an appeal for the shul, that they needed me to raise a lot of money. Even in rands, it was a lot of money. And I was thinking about the words to find what it is am I going to share that is going to explain how important it is to respond. And just a few weeks before the Yontif season, a friend of mine called me on a Friday and he said, my wife's just been involved in a terrible car accident. She's been taken to a particular hospital. The children are being airlifted to the Mill Park Emergency Hospital by helicopter. Could I be there, because he can't be in two places, to meet the children? So I jumped in the car, I was there, and I noticed what happens in an emergency room. Children off the helicopter, rushing, running, blood, sweat, tears. There was pandemonium, screaming, shouting, running. And a week later, I happened to visit somebody from my community who was in the hospice. And the hospice was another medical facility, which was a completely different experience. I walked into the hospice, there was classical music playing, plush carpets, everything was orderly, nobody was shouting, everything was just perfectly right. And I couldn't understand the vast contrast between two medical facilities. What is, I said to the community, the difference between an emergency room and the hospice? What's the nakuda? What's the one detail that makes the complete difference between an emergency room and a hospice? And obviously the difference is whether you believe you can still make a difference. Because if it's a decision that this is to make what's the inevitable as comfortable as possible, so that's one approach to medical facilities. But if you believe that there is hope, that we can make a difference, and at the time in South Africa the issue was that the community was dying and it was not a time in which to build, but a time in which to fold things up. If we believe that we can still make a difference, then we cannot do it silently. We cannot do it quietly. We've got to do it with an urgency. We've got to do it with power. We've got to do it with a sense of determination. Not wait and see, not a little bit, but it's got to be with everything we have, because we believe we can make a difference. It's in a sikha of the Rebbe relating to chinuch. In Parshas Emor, when it talks about the responsibilities of ensuring the purity of kahuna, of the priesthood of the Kohanim, and the pasuk begins by saying, Emor la kohanim v'amarta, you'll tell the Kohanim and you will tell them. And the double expression of you will tell and you will say beckons for interpretation. And Rashi interprets that the double expression is there by design because it is intended lahazir gdolim alaktanim. It's in order to tell the elders that this is so important that they will in turn tell it to the children, to the youngsters. This is an element of education that requires us to give the instruction in a way that it's going to be continued to be instructed. And the Rebbe identifies the fact that this form of instruction in the Torah only appears in 3 cases. Nowhere else in the whole Torah does it begin by saying Emor v'amarta, only in 3 situations. And the 3 situations happen to be in relation to the prohibition against imbibing blood, in the prohibition against partaking of insects, which we call chochos in South Africa, and also in the case that we're dealing with in Parshas Emor, the kahuna. And the Rebbe paints a theme, what we would think to be situations that would be impossible to reach through chinuch because of the incredible challenge, the impediment that we're confronting. It's precisely in those 3 areas that the Torah comes and says, Emor ve'omarta, don't give up on chinuch. Chinuch that is presented in the proper way is going to reach even those situations that you think are impossible. And the Rebbe quotes from the fact that there is Eichlei shkotzim, there are those who eat chochos. The Gemara tells us that it is only the most depraved, debased human being that eats insects. It represents a human being who somehow lost their focus, lost their idea of what it is to be a mensch, to be a human being, and has descended so low that he behaves in a way that a human being would not be expected to behave. What happens if you have in your classroom somebody who is no longer conforming to the norms of what we'd consider to be appropriate behavior? And what happens if we live in an environment, in a society, where those debased activities have gained a mantle of respectability, where the world is saying this is okay? And the person who's entering into the fray to confront the problem says, how can I make a difference? It's impossible. I don't have the language. I don't have the means of connecting with somebody who is absolutely so out of the ballpark. How am I going to bring a message to somebody who has lost the plot? And chas v'sholom, the child, is written off in our minds. So the Rebbe says that in that case, emoir ve'amarta, don't think for a moment that chinuch that is given from our etzem, from our heart, and from our neshama, with all of our being, is not going to affect even that child, even that human being. Don't surrender the ideal. There is no person that is too far gone. We can't chas v'sholom write off anybody. And when we extend ourselves with love and with devotion, then even the insect eater can be rehabilitated. And the second area in which we are told the words Emoir ve'amarta relates to the drinking of blood. And the Midrash tells us that that was the rage of the day. I mean, it's a little bit hard to identify with. Can't exactly work out how they did this. But that was the drug. When people wanted to get a high, they drank blood. Like today, a person would drink Coca-Cola, whatever it is that gives him a high. That was the rage of the day. Everybody was doing it. If you wanted to have a quick fix, drink blood. So it represented a society that had become so passionately habituated to that which was inappropriate that everybody again says, can't reverse it. This is what society is doing now. This is what everybody's doing now. This is what is vogue. This is the fashion. This is the trend. This is the peer pressure. This is what is happening in the classroom. Everybody's doing that. And all the other parents are allowing that to be done. And we all know that that resonates in our mind when we consider some of the things that we want to affect. We sometimes confuse the average with the normal. It was once said that what's the average amount of hands that a person has in the world? So we'd love to say 2, but unfortunately the scientific number is somewhere less than that because some people don't have hands. It's probably 1.99 something. That's the average. But if you ask a person, what's the normal situation when it comes to human hands? The answer's got to be 2. You can never confuse what is average for normal. What is normal is how it has to be according to the Torah, according to menschlichkeit, according to what is the appropriate way that is being given to us. Just because the average dictates that this is what everyone is doing, we shrug our shoulders, maybe we cry a little bit, and we give up on the ideal of what it is that we want to achieve. So the Rebbe says, Emoir ve'amarta, even in a situation where the world seems to be going crazy, everyone's doing it. It seems to be impossible to reverse. How are you going to change the world? And we look at how the Rebbe has changed the world and continues to change it. Did our Rebbe ever for a moment say to us, this is too complicated, this is too difficult? And the third reason, and third area in which the same words, Emoir ve'amarta, are mentioned, relates to kahuna. And the Rebbe says what is unique about the concept of kahuna is that it's an intangible. It's not something that is logical. You can't actually see what it is that you're identifying as important. And you're talking to people about luftike inyanim, things up there, things out there that don't seem to have something mamoshasdik that you can explain because they can understand what it is that you're saying is important. When it comes to the concepts of kahuna, tuma, tara, why? Why is this considered tameh and this not considered? Only because there is a dimension of this world that is ruchni. And the Eibush has dictated that this is the appropriate behavior. So we say to ourselves, it's fine to educate in things that we can explain, that we can show, we can demonstrate. But what about talking about worlds that nobody's ever been back from to explain what it looks like? We're talking about Olam HaHaba, and we're talking about Ruchnius, and we're talking about Emunah, and things that we cannot express in a tangible way. So we start diminishing. We're saying this doesn't really apply to this class. This can't really apply to this school. Somehow today in this world, we've got to go for a little bit less. We can't go for broke. With the ganze smetana. We've got to just somehow lower the goals so that we are able to make it relevant to our children. And the Emor Barometer comes and says, no, hold on to the values. Hold on to the Kedusha side of life. Don't compromise on what is the spiritual life force and the energy that holds it all together. Sometimes, as in football or in South Africa rugby, you go for the field goal, which isn't to get it under the bar. It's to get it over the bar. It's to aim for higher. It's to aspire to something that is beyond, and that is our responsibility. There were moments when I was more directly involved in the chinuch of the children at Torah Academy in Johannesburg that remain with me forever. One moment was a particular class that I ended the year, which is in December, in Kislev, and I didn't end it in a good place. We'd been at loggerheads. I felt that somehow I'd lost them. They weren't happy with me, I wasn't happy with them, and that's how the year ended. And I was quite devastated that we somehow ended on a note that was punitive and that was negative, and that. So this was bothering me for a few days after school closed, and eventually I just had to do something. I called one of them. And I said, is this whatever it was? Yossi, is that you? And there was a deadly silence on the other side, because the last guy he wanted to hear from a week into his holiday was that guy Hazdan. No way that he wanted to hear that voice. And on the pretext of wanting to find a place for Shabbaton the following year, I said, I'm looking at places for next year. I'm going into the mountains for 3-4 days. Maybe you can get the guys to come and we'll go backpacking for 4 days in the Drakensberg, which is beautiful. There was again silence. I said, don't rush. I'll call you tomorrow. You'll tell me if you're coming. And the next week, we spent 4 days in the Drakensberg. We hiked up the amphitheater, which is full backpacks, tents, and we went up the chain ladders, 100 chain ladders, the rungs of the chain ladder. We pitched tents on top of the escarpment. And the next morning at 4 o'clock, I woke them up, and we sat on the edge of the cliffs over which falls the Tugela Falls, the second biggest falls in the world, second highest falls in the world. And as the sun was rising, I said to the guys, sometimes the sun rises just for one day. Sometimes the sun can rise for a lifetime. And then we carried on, and we had a good time. And 4 years later, when this child was talking about his 12 years of schooling, he was honest. He said, I don't know if I'll remember much from 12 years of schooling. There's lots of things I will remember, I won't remember. But the one moment that was my moment at school was the moment that the sun rose not just for one day, it rose for a lifetime. It was a morning that relationships were put back into place, connections were rekindled. And somehow, even in the most despairing situations, with innovation and creativity and commitment, they're waiting Our students are waiting for us to do the gesture, to begin the process of healing and bringing it all together. It is in the Hayom Yom of Chof Beis Teves that the Rebbe Rashab tells us, and when we talk about parents and we're talking about teachers or we talk about students and children, we know they are intertwined. Vanecho and Talmidecho, Elo Talmidim, we know that they're intertwined. The Rebbe Rashab says that in the same way as we spend half an hour, or we spend time putting on tefillin every single morning, in the same way we should take half an hour each day to think about the chinuch of our children, which probably means our Talmidim too. And the Rebbe asks, why is it that the Rebbe Rashab chose the mitzvah specifically of tefillin? The other mitzvahs we do every day. We give tzedakah every day, we daven every day. Why did he say that in the same way as you put on tefillin every day, that is how you think about the education of your children every day for half an hour? And the Rebbe explains that with the mitzvah of tefillin, there's something unique. We have the sinking, not I-N-K, the other sink. We're bringing together of our minds and our hearts and our actions. There's a complete bringing together of what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and what we're doing. That is what's unique to the mitzvah of tefillin. We bring it all together. It's a focus moment of knowing that it all matters. How we think, how we feel, and how we do. And the Rebbe explains that the reason why the Rebbe Rashab said specifically when we think of chinuch, it's tefillin, because when we come to chinuch, it has to be the way we think, it has to be the way we feel, and the way we act. If we're acting there, and we're thinking there, and we're not feeling at all, the kids know it right away. If we really want to impact on our children, it's got to be completely brought together of heart, of mind, and of action. I started by talking about my father because Reb Dovid brought me onto the subject. The day that I went off to yeshiva, I arrived the next morning in Kfar Chabad. I was 16 years old. I was in the yeshiva on a Sunday morning. It was Motzei Shabbos flight. And I was in the yeshiva and I saw that there was a postman, which was an interesting phenomenon for me to learn about as well. A Chassidish-looking postman, a guy with a beard. And weeks later, I was in the central shul and I saw the postman Farbrengen in the midst of all the people. And I asked somebody, what is the postman saying? They said, that's the mashpia of Kfar Chabad when you're in the postman. He happened to deliver mail during the week. So I'm standing in the yeshiva, and I see guys pointing him in my direction. So I think, okay, it's obviously a mistake. I left last night. It takes, at that time from South Africa, it probably took about 2 weeks for a letter to arrive, and I just left last night. So this obviously wasn't intended for me. But lo and behold, it was. It was a letter from my father. And I opened the letter, and he said, I can get emotional thinking about it. You've just arrived in yeshiva. You're probably feeling, and he described how I was feeling. And he gave me advice, and gave me thoughts and encouragement. This meant that 2 weeks before I left home, he was concerned how I would be feeling on that Sunday morning. That's chinuch. That's unbelievable anticipation, thought process. Being aware, wanting to act on the needs of a child, way beyond the child is even aware of the problem and the difficulty. In the Midrash, it tells us about Moshe Rabbeinu's choice as a leader by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Midrash tells us that he was a Rei Tzoyin, and Moshe Haya Rei Tzoyin, he was a shepherd. And as we know the Midrash, there was a particular day that a sheep got lost or started running away from the herd, just not the way it was normally, part of the herd. And Moshe Rabbeinu begins to run after the sheep, and eventually it's a pool of water, and the sheep begins to drink, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, thirsty. That's what you were thirsty. And he lifts up the the Sep Zur, as the Rebbe says, and he brings the sheep home. That was the criteria for greatness, for the greatest greatness. What was the criteria? The criteria was caring, being concerned, being involved. Now, standing a day from Gimel Tammuz, we think of the Rebbe's attitude to those many sheep around the world, lost in far-off places, in South Africa, in Australia, represented here, but in countries around the whole world. Sheep, lots of lost sheep. And the Rebbe pursued us, and he chased after us, and he found us, and he explained to us how thirsty we are. And he lifts us. And not only does he lift us to the point that we are resolved as a sheep, but the Rebbe asks us for much more than that. I don't want you to be a sheep that's not lost. I want you to be a shepherd. And what the Rebbe is asking all of us in this difficult age and this difficult time is that we rise to the occasion to respond, particular time of Gimel Tammuz, to be the sheep that is no longer lost, that becomes the shepherd, looking after the sheep that we can find beyond. I started by saying that there is a responsibility to keep ourselves warm. There was a young girl in South Africa many years ago. I think I can say it. Her husband today is one of the shluchim present today, who was in a school that wasn't a Lubavitcher school. There wasn't a Chabad school in Johannesburg. And there was a discussion in the classroom about Kiruv. At that time, it was not popular outside of the courtyards of Chabad. And the Rebbe was explaining to her that there is a problem with Kiruv. And the mashal that he gave, and he said was, if you have a hot pot of soup, and you take a teaspoon of cold and you put it into the soup, what happens? It becomes warm. You do it again, it becomes warm. But you do it again and again and again and again and again, mathematically, somewhere down the line, the pot is not going to be hot enough to warm the cold. In fact, the cold is going to make the whole pot cold. And that, he thought, demonstrated adequately the dangers of utilizing our energies far afield and how that can adversely affect ourselves. And this young girl, I think she's brilliant. This young girl turned to her Rebbe and said, that only applies if the pot is off the fire. But if the pot is on the fire, you can add and you can add and you can add. Everything becomes warm. The challenge for all of us, Mechanchim, in this difficult time and era, confronting Jewish continuity and recognizing the importance of chinuch, is that we remain on the fire, that we remain connected to the source, and that coming from Gimel Tammuz, and please God, for a year and for years, we remain connected to our Rebbe, because that gives us the power and the warmth and the heat to affect every world around us. And may we respond to that fire that the Rebbe lights in all of us by doing everything we can to educate the next generation, to love the Torah, to love the Eibishter, to love each other, and to be committed to bringing this world to Mashiach Tzidkenu that we so desire. Thank you.